I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. A previous guest, Dan Gardner, spoke about forecasting and risk. One of his central points was, as he put it, the things we're doing now are so incredibly complex, to see even a little bit into the future takes an enormous amount of struggle, and even then we're going to make mistakes. As CEO of Nurole, predicting just 12 months out is hard. As we expand, variables and risks multiply. Anything I can do to take risk off the table is helpful. In the past, I've been blind to the risk of FX exposure in our budgeting. A small movement could eat into our investment budget and compromise our credibility when our forecasts are wrong. If you want to remove risk from your foreign exchanges without breaking the bank, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Thomas Thune Andersen, is chair of Lloyd's Register Group and Lloyd's Register Foundation, former chair of Ørsted, where he oversaw the company's pivot from fossil fuels to renewables and its landmark IPO, and chair of VKR Holding, the Velux owner, until March 2025. He also serves on the IMI PLC board and previously spent 3 decades at AP Møller-Maersk, including as CEO of Maersk Oil. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Can you pick 3 moments that you feel have most shaped how you show up as a non-executive board member today?
I think back at my executive career, what are some of the things that really have been part of shaping that and bringing that into the boardroom as well? I think one of them is having had an opportunity to work very much in an international environment and through a lot of different cultures. You can then pick specific examples of that, because when you then get into the boardroom, it's very much about probably having the experience, the knowledge of having seen an international environment, but especially different cultures, how they work together, and pick up what are the similarities, because we are all human. So it's a question about across all cultures, we have some common threads, but also the differences in the culture. So culture, international, I think is one thing that is important for me to bring into the boardroom. The other thing is simply the generic thing of having had an executive experience, because you sit in the boardroom and probably the single most important thing you have as a board is to ensure that you have a well-functioning professional management team. So being able to at least understand what are some of the drivers and so on. So the sheer fact that you have had an executive experience, I think, is very important in how you have a chance to be a successful board member. And then I think on a more specific one is the opportunity I have had, and many have had, to be the CEO. Because being the CEO, you move away and need to deal much more with duality. You need much more to create compromises. You need much more to understand many different stakeholders. And that is probably one of the most enduring and important things in a board, is to be able to understand, address, make decisions, but understand all the stakeholders.
For someone listening to this who hasn't operated outside of one culture, say they've only operated in the UK or only operated in the US, can you bring to life what you mean by that?
If you sit again in a Chinese environment, I was once sitting trying to negotiate a deal. It was about some vessels for an offshore oil operation. And I felt I had all the cards on my hand, and I was pushing the issue, and I was eventually saying, listen, these are the terms. You have another 5 hours, go away, think about it, and come back. The Chinese read that as they were losing face, the famous expression about losing face, because I had put them in a situation where they could only come back and in a way be binary, i.e. no we don't, or yes we will. And that for them in their culture was a very difficult position to be in. So they actually never came back to me because they felt I had played them off the board, if you will, if it was a game. So I had to go back and say, listen, guys, shouldn't we talk? And I actually lost all the trumps I had on my hand because I didn't understand that the way I should have articulated would have been slightly more about some options. That doesn't mean that you couldn't be very strict and all that, but it is just a little bit about the way you navigate. Had this been in Scandinavia, people would have said, yeah, that's fine. I understand that's a game. And they would probably have come back with a yes or no or an alternative. But I had lost them because I didn't understand that I had put them in a corner where they couldn't find a way out.
It feels to me that in a world that on some levels is moving away from globalization, that one of the biggest cultural challenges boards face are the cultural differences between the generations. Is that something you've experienced? And if so, how do you think about bridging those cultural gaps?
Yeah, and I think it's an extraordinarily relevant question, and it opens up what we will probably talk about is the broader thing about how relevant is a board today? How can we make a board more relevant for the future? But that's a very big mouthful, and let's try and slice it in some smaller bits. And yes, I think you're absolutely right about how do we bridge some of that generational difference. I've experienced and wished to have different generations as well as different races and so on board, on a board. What I've also found is that if we look at the agenda we have on the board today and so forth, a lot of it is around governance, a lot of it is about control and so on and so forth. And even though we would like to have the younger voice, they are better at disruption, they are better at some of the technology, how that evolves, better at how do you go to market and so on. When you then present the agenda of a typical board meeting, they're looking at it and say, but what am I doing here? Because there's only two of the items that I really think is relevant, and all this governance things, yes, it's important, but I don't really see it. So we need to try and find a way to do that. One of the ways is to get the voice of the young people into the boardroom, either by, in a company, sometimes invite them along as guests, have some topics that where you encourage them to get involved. So that's one way of doing it. Another one, which I think is quite successful, is what I like to term reverse mentoring, so that each board member actually has one or two mentors. So it's not the board member who is a mentor of one of the employees. It is actually some of the younger generation in the company who are mentors, and the board member becomes the mentee. I've enjoyed that a lot. I think it has been very good at opening eyes and having an environment where I, as a board member or the chair, could actually talk and learn about how is the thinking, how is these things perceived and so on, so that we don't get into that all the communication is one directional, but it's two directional.
Can you first expand on how has that impacted how you have operated as a board member, and can you give examples?
Yeah. So in one company where I've been on, I had so we created a situation where I had reverse mentoring, as I call it. In this case, it was 3 young people who were selected. So, of course, there is some kind of subjectivity because somebody is selected is not totally random, but we have three. One from the US, one from the Far East, one from Europe with a gender mix, but all of them younger. One of them a grad, another one was more of a factory floor worker. So there was quite a diversity in that. It took me at least 2 sessions before they realized that they were there to help me. And it was not kind of a situation where we'd say, well, welcome. They could ask me questions about the company, but it was actually getting into the detail of it. And then some of the things that was for me very useful were a discussion about the company culture. How did they see it? How did they perceive it? As we got kind of more around that discussion, another session was about what is it that you, as your generation, what is it that you see where you feel that the communication and or the way we walk the talk is misleading or is artificial or is not true? And you suddenly start picking up when you think you do something that it is actually perceived slightly differently. So of course it does become something where you do test how a lot of the decisions or the reactions or the way you behave, how that is received. And then the third stage, when you have been doing this for a year and a half, is you start asking them advice about how can we do things better. And if we talk about the generation change, you can also think about whether you actually do take some of the strategy work out of the boardroom. You have worked with it, and you could, of course, make a committee of the board. In some ways, it's more administration, but if you do it right, I think you get so much input that it is better. And then you can simply create a group of people who can have a second opinion, a second voice, because they know how things are received and how it works on different levels of the organization.
So it sounds like it gives you something fundamentally different as a board member from, say, a survey. You could have put a survey out there to the entire organization, got a broad-based input. This 1-to-1 or 3-to-1 in this case interaction is giving you a two-way channel into the organization.
Exactly. The engagement survey or employee survey or what you call it can be a very useful tool, because if I'm sitting as a chair, I'm looking at it and so on, it tells me some things which can be some of the things that I would like to have a conversation with these people about. So I think it is nearly an underrated tool, the engagement surveys, and I know they are very much used, but I think we can all get more use out of them, and we can be even better at finding out how we ask the questions and how we study that. So it is a very important tool to get the full benefit out of, for example, reverse mentoring.
It's really interesting you say they didn't understand what the board was, because I think that's quite a common phenomenon, that the board is this sort of black box that, other than the executive team, no one really understands. And when you have had these discussions, or what are you aiming for, if in the ideal world, for every board or all the employees in the organizations where you're on the board to understand of the board, and what is the relationship that you're looking to foster?
First and foremost, it is to demystify the board. And then you can come with examples. I've seen examples where it has been convenient for management to kind of say that we have this mystery thing up there called the board, and they don't allow this or they allow that and so forth. Or we have had ones where they're not part of the communication. So I think in my ideal world, I see my role as a chair. In all my communication, until I need to do something dramatically different, but until that time, it is with my own words and so on, as either the chair or as a board member, to show the alignment with management. And it is about, sometimes using the same words, sometimes using my own words with a peculiar accent or whatever, but doing that to show the whole organization that there is an alignment between management, the board, and the rest of the organization. Then when the opportunity is there, I think it is very important for board members to walk about. In an ideal world, I think individual board members should have the opportunities individually to visit certain parts of an organization. That means it's all much more relaxed. It's not red carpet, and they can come out with on the basis of a specific topic or whatever. They can come out and they can hear and they can listen. But it is equally important that this board member makes a town hall or whatever and stands up and fields questions and uses the opportunity to tell a little bit about the board work. Sharing, what a board agenda is, not necessarily a lot of the secret content of each item, which can be difficult for other reasons, but at least what the agenda points are, I think is surprising to many in an organization.
Do you think boards should share that as a matter of good practice? I mean, it'd be easy enough for them to email it round to the entire organization. This is what's going to be discussed on the board today.
Yeah. I've been in organizations where we are probably not sending out what the agenda is in advance, but after a board meeting, we make a paper which tells the whole organization, for everyone, we have just had a board meeting. We were basically covering these items. We had this and the results of so it becomes a bit of some fact sharing, but also telling them a little bit about what some of the discussions or debates were around.
I love that.
Yeah.
Why don't you do that on every board? That sounds like a brilliant.
Yeah, and I think it is. And sometimes there's cultures that needs to be changed before you get to that. And we also sometimes, there is a very delicate balance about information to shareholders and information internally and insiders, not that they become. So it's a little bit of a delicate balance, but a balance you can find and you can deal with. And I think it is very useful.
Can you talk more about that? So for a board member listening to this, thinking, gosh, Thomas, I love that idea. I want us to get to that stage where we can share the conclusions that we reach from our board meetings with the whole organization. What are the typical blockers you've come across limiting your ability to do that? And how have you gone about unblocking them? How that someone listening might learn from?
I think you need to be aligned with management because management have different styles and so on. So it has to be through, staff in general. They can see through if you do things that are artificial and not kind of in the true sense of the way you are. So you need to be aligned with management in order to do that. And then there is really no particular blocker from that. There will be items that you cannot circulate because you could be talking about whether you should do a CEO change or whatever. You would not do that. But the general theme about this time around, it was very much about talking about the year's result. We were looking backwards in this meeting, and this one we were talking about the strategy, and we were very excited to see the work that was done around how we could expand in Asia and things that are giving some direction of travel. There shouldn't be any particular blockers in that.
That's certainly one of the issues that I sometimes say. I've always liked the idea of, as a CEO, being able to share everything that I'm working on. And then, of course, you hit a patch where you're working on something that's particularly sensitive. And then the absence of information that you're sharing then suddenly comes out as a red flag. And so actually then it's easier not to share anything at the rest of the time to avoid highlighting there is something, that might be of sort of concern to parts of the organization.
But isn't that the issue around any kind of change when you do that? Because, the first time you do this, the organization might think, oh, why are they doing it? And they will start reading into the nth detail every word you're sending out, and start maybe digesting it too much. But if it's part of a routine and so on, they see that, they understand that, and you probably will not have that much speculation around one particular issue about thinking that there might be, why didn't they talk about this or why didn't they talk about that? But we are back to the trust and the transparency, because if the trust is there that you believe that the management and the board are aligned and they want to share what some of the main things are.
Yeah, the other issue that I've come across is that the organization has their heads down in their particular area and they don't have enough time to digest whatever is being circulated at the board level. And then you can sometimes run into this risk where the board think they've already communicated because it was in the board packs, but actually people didn't read that. And therefore, just circulating the board packs hasn't been enough. We've had to then do on top of that town halls or other deeper dives for those who don't learn through just reading and need some sort of conversation or other form of media. Is that something you've experienced?
Yes. But I think you are addressing a few things here at the same time, because a lot of the decisions taken in the boardroom in conjunction with management is often about strategy, or it is about organizational changes, or it is opening new markets. So a lot of them are kind of big things that requires quite a lot of communication. There's for a number of the staff, it might just be an information, but for a lot of staff, it has a real impact. So you need to communicate this at many different levels. And again, back to the role of the board here is to be part of making the decision, but after that, to make sure that the board would typically look at what is in the communication plan for this decision, and et cetera, et cetera. But they are not themselves out there communicating it, because then you are defranchising the management, because that is their role, to be seen as the communicator of what you need to do there. So it is very much a question, I think, of making sure that the roles are understood here. And we are back to, again, what is the role of the board? The role of the board is to ensure that you have a good, strong management. You support them, you communicate, you support their communication, you are part of the strategy, you are an owner of the strategic priorities as a board, and you are a co-signer of the strategic plan. And that is what you monitor in the boardroom. But the challenge I think we have in the boardroom is that we're spending too much time on looking at how we are tracking. Even if we are tracking okay, we are spending a lot of time on tracking that, and we are spending far too little time talking about the future. So again, another thing that I think we got a little bit out of the corona, and that we to a larger degree can do more by Teams or Zoom, etc., is, and I haven't succeeded in that, but we've tried to do it, is to say that every time we are together physically, we only talk about the future, because everything about the past we can manage on a Teams meeting. And that way you probably end up having more board meetings, but shorter board meetings, because you can have kind of a Teams meeting for an hour and a half to look through some of the performance things. And when you are together, you talk about forward-looking strategy, or succession plans and people, organizational changes as you move forward.
Positioning yourself for your next board role is different from landing your first. Nurole Plus gives you personal expert support to refine how you present your board value, strengthen your expertise on fast-moving topics, and unlock more prestigious opportunities. head to plus.nurole.com to find out more. Let's move on to talk about Ørsted, because it's an incredible story, and I think it's an inspiring and instructive case study for board members navigating ambitious projects.
Yeah, Ørsted is, a lack of a better word, a Danish utility, which about 10, 15 years ago was a mix of an oil and gas company, a power plant company, a grid company, had some involvement in renewable, had electrical cars and many different things. So it was a pretty wide one with some very interesting and good projects, but a lot of them hadn't materialized yet. So we were suddenly seeing an organization which was quite complex, quite diverse, and not really getting the cash flow from its different involvements before in 5 or 10 years' time. So you're kind of running into a crunch about an overcommitted investment situation without getting all the cash flows in there. A revision of what the purpose of the company was, but first of all, from a point of view of being in a situation where there was a real cash problem, so you needed kind of a turnaround to kind of make sure that and sell certain things off, but then you needed to focus in on a strategy, and the strategy became a strategy believing in renewable energy, especially offshore wind. And the decision to be taken at that time was two things we needed to believe in. One of them was that you could make a renewable business that was not dependent on subsidies. We felt we needed to know that within a few years we wouldn't need subsidies. And the other one, that the cost of electricity created by renewable offshore wind could be competitive. So we needed to believe in that. The journey then became that we said, that is what we are going to do. We have an oil and gas company. If we put all our money in the oil and gas company, we will still only be an oil and gas company of this roughly the same size and so forth. Whereas if we use that money in the renewable business, it can change the industry, because at that time there wasn't really a proven industry. So probably the biggest strategic decision we took was to sell our oil and gas business, which was 60% of the cash flow of the company, to use kind of a focus on the offshore wind. And then we hit a period of time when there was a lot of following wind. We did get the supply chain organized and construction of offshore wind farms so that it became competitive, a huge aspiration for growth, etc., etc. And now a situation where with inflation and other things, some of the cost base have been temporarily moved in a negative direction, which for some projects have made them less attractive. A lot of the projects are still very attractive, but some of them are not attractive. That's a statement of fact. And then, of course, headwinds right now in the US, where the administration over there have an agenda that says that they just don't want renewables, they want more fossil fuel.
You are facing the classic innovator's dilemma with oil and gas as your cash cow, to make that leap into renewables and say we're going to leave behind our cash generator and go into this brave new world. Can you talk me through what enabled you as a board to get the comfort to reach that conclusion?
Yeah. There's something around, where do you sit right now? Do you sit between wanting to try and safeguard something you have without very much growth, but probably with some profit and you can keep it going over time, i.e. the oil company? Or do you believe that there is a market out there that, if it is proven, because you need to get the cost of electricity down, you needed to make some changes, that would actually be big and sizable and would be worthwhile? So how do you have a discussion around a whole board taking ownership of having a dream? Because that's fundamentally what it was. And I think a lot of the people on the board, for cultural background reasons, for practical things, were in the space of wanting to see more renewable. So, we started out with a discussion to say, how can we be pushing more renewable without necessarily making the big decision? We then had, in that case, a shareholder, Goldman Sachs, who in their own analytical world could see some opportunities. So, you got the quality of a worldwide super analytical company that could kind of give some of the data and the facts about, but if you do this, the market could potentially be, and so on and so forth. So how do you? It's that journey you're on, and again, we were not having a board meeting saying, okay, on this board meeting on the 26th of September, we will decide whether it is green or blue. It is an evolution, but it was an evolution that required that we sold off certain things. We then decided to sell off the oil and gas, and believing that we would go into the renewable, we needed to look at the supply chain. We needed to change the organization, because the people who were designing the offshore wind farms at that time were oil field engineers. They construct things because each oil field is unique. So they build it, I would argue, gold-plated, because if there's even more oil or gas there, then you want to make it so that you can get everything. Whereas putting out 100 turbines, they are hugely expensive, each of them, but it's 100 similar ones. So we moved away from the typical way of designing things offshore to look at how do you do a lean operation in factories. So we focused on the supply chain to bring the cost of the supply chain down, make the projects faster, more standardized, and in doing so, get the cost of electricity down.
So it sounds like having the sort of the right people in place is clearly important, with the dreamers and this sort of, you talk about this evolution each stage. I remember a CEO once saying to me, don't worry about, getting to where you want to be in 20 years, just get to where you want to be in 1 year, and it'll be a lot easier to figure out how you get to where you want to be in 5 years. And it sounds like there's an element of that there. Obviously, since you've left the board, Ørsted, it's since run into these sort of headwinds with the US that you mentioned, and I suppose spikes in inflation as well. And I think it's sort of announced that it's doing a major rights issue. I'm interested, with the benefit of hindsight now, is there anything you would have done differently that a board member listening might learn from, where they are, have got the future ahead of them, as it were?
I think you need, again, to look at the kind of business you're in. And this business is a very capital-intensive business with very big projects that runs up in the billions of pounds or dollars or whatever. So the issue there is that each project in its own right is very, very big and requires so much cash and so on. And then if you have a machine that has successfully run, where you are farming down, you are making projects, when you are finished, you farm them down and so forth, then you need a pipeline that does that, because otherwise you're not fueling that kind of machine. If we stopped up and said no, we will certainly now find that somebody pulls a plug and for a particular geographical area, in this case the US, will stop the ability to do that. Then of course you shouldn't have invested there. Challenge there being that a lot of these negotiations, they take 8 or 10 years before you start. So the real challenge here is the discussion about sunk cost, because when you get into these projects, you are beginning to put in, and then you might say, oh, yes, it's not so attractive, but at least the forward IRR is okay because we have already sunk so much money in. So if we walk away, that money is lost and so on. So you get into this horrible dilemma about sunk cost, which at some times is really relevant, but in some times can keep you stuck into something where you need to stop up and say, no, it's really painful to stop something now because we have had that, but it is actually better than the alternative. But those decisions become some of the most difficult ones where you are halfway there, and then the world changes on you.
Yeah, and in my experience, one of the challenges is, the projects less well look more attractive because you don't yet understand the gnarly bits of them. Yeah. And so sometimes when you're sort of presented with that sunk cost fallacy challenge where someone says, well, look, actually, let's write off what we've already invested here and let's just look at these two projects side by side and this generates a higher IRR. What I think that can sometimes miss is the fact that on a risk-adjusted basis, one devil, you don't know the other yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you use devil's advocates on your board as a strategy, or how? Because it was a heck of a bet, I guess. And if you're going to make a concentrated bet, the US historically has always felt like one place where you felt like you'd be comfortable doing it.
It's easy to sound like excuses or whatever, but going back 6 years, so Ørsted projects that are more than that was created more than 6 years ago and are up and running now, they're all attractive, good cash flow and all that. So what's painful now are the ones that are under construction right now, because the projects that have not yet started construction, they are of course negotiated in a different era and have something. So yes, this is a lump of ones you have there in the middle. And the thing was that we were not being criticized, but we were being asked a lot about, the US is opening up. Ørsted, are you going to play in there, and so on and so forth. And the first bid we made there, we lost. And that had a negative impact on the share price. Then the next one we won, and it had a hugely positive. So as we won 2 or 3 projects in the US, our share price went up 20, 30, 40%. And, so you can say, okay, so if we hadn't gone in, the market at that time would have perceived that we were not competitive for the US market. And for that reason, we would probably have a share. It's all, you can debate history forwards and backwards. But we believe that the US was a solid and a good place to be. I actually still think it is a good place to be. But it would be nice to have less there right now and have a little bit more in a future pipeline.
Yeah, and I guess what's ultimate, it reminds me of podcast I was listening to with Jamie Dimon, where he was talking about when he first came into JP Morgan and got them to relook at the stress tests. And when he first came in, they were looking at what happens if interest rates go up 4%. And he's like, no, we need to look at what happens if they go up, whatever it was, 15%, because we don't need it to be a good economic case, but we need to make sure that the ship doesn't sink. And I suppose one of the challenges that Ørsted now faces is that they've got a liquidity crunch at the wrong time, or an unfavorable moment in time. And I wonder, for board members listening, is that the key thing to be sort of mindful of? Like, where are your liquidity crunches and what are your options in those scenarios if the worst comes to happen?
You're right. I think my experience has been every single one of the things that has happened and is now giving headwinds to Ørsted or to any of the other organizations that I'm involved with, so it doesn't have to be an Ørsted debate, is that we go through risk things and we do plans and we try and compensate and so forth. The thing we seldom ask ourselves is that they actually all happen at the same time. So we had a very good, on interest rates, yes, we could manage that. Oh, but if the US dollar does this, yes, but we can manage that. If raw material price, we do that. But we didn't kind of go down and said, no, they all happen at the same time. And that's a little bit to your point about whether you do 4% or 15%.
Yeah, it's what Dan Gardner talked about in episode 85 and 86. He's the author of Super Forecasting, and that we consistently underestimate the fat tail risks, that we think they are just vanishingly small in probability, but actually they happen more often than we think, and they're worse than we think, and measurably so. He had some wonderful data on that. Thomas, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you few short questions and ask you for quick responses if you're ready.
I am ready for that, yes.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
Shackleton's Way, the story about a person who never led more than 25 people, basically never succeeded in anything he set out to do in his life, but on every single journey brought everyone back safe despite their journey.
Most impactful question you've heard in the boardroom?
I don't understand what you're saying. Said in a polite way. It is a courage to say as a board member, I'm not sure I understand yet.
What's a boardroom myth you think needs busting?
That the board knows everything. The board needs to be educated, trained, understand, see the business. It's not kind of a group of gurus who can answer every question, i.e. the role of the board.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Some board members who want to comment on every single thing that is being discussed, even though it's already, they don't have anything to add. It's just, a reconfirmation but they love to hear their voice.
Most valuable board ritual?
Probably when we are not sitting in the boardroom, i.e. we walk the corridor. Get out. For me, making a board, I really like that. Every time we have a board meeting, somehow and somewhere we need to walk through the office. If you, as a board member and everyone else, if you look at people, you can see whether they are smiling or whether they are hiding away or whether they're looking at you or not. It gives you so much input.
Favorite quote?
A leader is a dealer in hope.
Your most significant professional insight?
We are board members before we are specialists. It is a discipline to be a board member, which is about being curious, being open-minded, interested, and being prepared to change your mind.
The worst professional advice you've ever received?
As a chair, I should sit at the head of the table, which I think is the worst advice. I should sit at the middle of the table.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
Whether they are fit for purpose. How do we get the young people into the board? How do we make sure that we have a board that is really sharp on governance, but also a board that is sharp on looking at new technologies and get a group of people together? Or should we split it so we have a board that looks at governance and another board that looks at future strategy and other things?
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
We in a way, we talked about it because the judgment was that the US was a safe place. And fundamentally, I still believe it is, but we need to weather a little bit of a storm.
Okay, and so what's the learning from that?
If it happens as massively and as fast as it is, it comes back to the sunk cost discussion, because we should probably, the judgment would have been, it would have been fixed faster and so on and so forth, which we thought it would. It wasn't. Had we believed it would have been dragging out as long as this, it would probably have been easier to have the discussion around sunk costs and sacrifice that.
And would that have resulted in greater diversification of asset allocation and therefore less concentration risk?
Probably, yeah, but the concentration risk is still that the US is still only, the US is still the biggest concentration for Ørsted and so forth. So the UK. So, but it would have allowed an exit.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
Probably, I'm a better board member now because I realize that my war stories are boring.
Finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
We have circled around it again about the management role versus the board role and so on. So I would maybe phrase it in the way of saying that one of the things we should take away is remember to ask the board how they perceive, remember to ask the management how they perceive the board and what the board could do, in their opinion, to make their job, their day better, more efficient, more effective. Another takeaway, and again, something we have touched upon, that board members are board members first and specialists second. Takeaway, I still find we are talking too much history and too little future. Which then points, and it's not a fourth one, but is a way of chipping in a fourth one, is to spend more time as a board to talk about what they would like to see on the agenda. There's a tendency that it is management or maybe the chair who kind of designs the agenda. And I think if you end every board meeting or ask all board members to say, and what would you like on the agenda next time? I think as board members, we tend to be too passive. We are just receiving the board pack and the agenda.
Thomas, there have been no boring war stories in this. Refreshing to have the direct Danish honesty that I used to work with back in the earlier part of my career as an investor. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that it has some use, and I would love to follow up in one way or the other if there are any specifics here that would be worthwhile.
If you're ready to position yourself for the next stage of your board career, with expert advice behind you, Nurole Plus can help. As a listener, you get 10% off. Head to plus.nurole.com and use code ENTER at checkout.